All right, everyone. We have a really good guest on. Friend of mine. Talked to him several times. Just a really good head for games. A game designer. Jacob Hampton. How you doing, man?
Doing well. How are you doing, Dan?
I'm doing good. Doing good. So, little history about us. Me and you. We met basically in the Austin Alternative Gaming Freaks, right? We just sort of,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, just started talking about things. Play tested some of your games, played some games together. Still want that OPR rematch where you destroyed me, but we'll get there.
But
But
I have
yeah,
a
yeah.
perfect record against you. Why would I ever ruin that?
Yeah, yeah. So Jacob, just tell us, just for those who don't know you, you just tell us a little bit about, maybe a little bit about your history in wargaming, and then we can talk about some of your projects and some of your stuff you've got going on.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I first started wargaming. Uh, I remember it was the 1996 Warhammer Fantasy box of Lizardmen versus Bretonia. I
Yeah.
don't know if I started in 96. It might have been the year after. But I was a little kid. I got those Bretonians. I painted them like Easter eggs. They were horrible. I actually still have a few that look stunning, let's say. Um, and I grew up playing it on my floor, using my shoes as terrain and things like that.
Hmm.
A bit later, my brother and I, we got the 40K Space Marines versus Orcs starter and played that a fair bit. But the first miniature game I really got big into would have been Mordheim. A
Mm.
bit later, towards high school, and then in college, we got really big into both Warhammer Fantasy and Mordheim. I was a competitive player back in seventh edition of Warhammer Fantasy, but Mordheim was my first game design experience as well, because instead of playing a traditional campaign, I sort of became a game master for my friends, and we ended up uh, having this whole big storyline. And as we did that, I wanted to make up new mechanics for the types of things they would encounter. So that's kind of my very first step into game design. Later in college, I got into a bigger variety of games. That's when I started playing Monster Apocalypse was a big one. Malifaux, War Machine, Infinity, X-Wing when it came along, whole bunch more. I also made my first game from scratch around then called Headball, which is a ultraviolet sports game where there is no ball. You have to cut people's heads off and dunk that into the basket.
Yes, that game.
Um,
That game is so
yeah,
sounds so
so
cool.
which well, we'll talk more later, but I may have some updates on that. But back to history, back to history. Recently, I moved to Austin in 2018. Um, I was living in Hawaii before that. Hawaii is wonderful, but there's very little game clubs there. So my wife and I played a lot of Kings of War during our time there. Um, and we also tried to pick up Flames of War a little bit.
Hmm.
But the game club was kind of just us and like one or two other people from time to time. So when we moved to Austin, we really joined a much more active game community, and that's when I started getting into more. So recently, I picked up BattleTech, I picked up Marvel Crisis Protocol, and Star Wars Legion, and I've really started making my own pretty rapidly here as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think that you're kind of feeling me as as sort of a person who got into wargaming in the 90s. It's so different where it used to really just be Games Workshop. But it was also, I feel, back in the day when Games Workshop was doing, I feel, some of their best work during the sort of the mid to late 90s. I mean, you're right. Warhammer, I mean, that's the iconic. I have some of those Bretonian archers still. Right?
Oh
Everyone
yeah,
does, right?
everyone's got a few archers in a drawer somewhere if you
Yeah, yeah.
hold in the
But
90s.
second and third were around fantasy. And then of course, we talked about Necromunda, Mordheim,
Mhm.
Blood Bowl, second edition, which was sort of the main one.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, the old
I
Death
did
Zone
love
exp
Blood Bowl.
second zone. I mean, and just keep on going where it felt but I also kind of connect with you in that back in those days. you did play on the kitchen table with your friends. You had soda bottles, you had books as terrain. Like, I feel sometimes the wargaming hobby has become so maybe commercialized is a good word for it, where I feel like everyone has to have these, these great terrain boards and everything else whenever, I feel going back to our roots, you just to really just play on whatever. I played on my cousin's floor. That's how I got into 40K. So yeah, yeah, I love it. I love it.
Yeah, our hills for a while in college were just the boxes the miniatures came in.
Mm-hmm.
Turn
Yeah.
it standing straight up, it's now a tower, we're fighting over.
Mm-hmm. Coke cans. I mean, that was our
Oh,
thing. Coke
gotta
cans.
have Coke cans on the table.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Even one apocalypse game, where the Stompo is the brand new thing for orcs. So one of my friends turned a trash can upside down and put a little post-it note orc face on the front of it for his
Hmm.
Stompa. It wasn't just terrain. It
Yeah.
was, I mean, we've all faced a Coke can Carnifex at some point too.
Well, that sort of stuff was even encouraged back then. I don't know, you
Hmm.
remember like those early editions of 40K and Fantasy. They didn't produce all the models. They just
Hmm.
sort of GW would just sort of say, "Yeah, just go and create your own or do your own thing," and create. I remember the cardboard rhinos. They didn't have rhinos, so you just have the cardboard rhinos that you'd print out. Well, that's so cool. Well, so from there you mentioned you're a game designer. So tell us a little bit about, some of the stuff you've worked on, not just war games, but also RPGs. Specifically though, so we're talk about that and then getting into skirmish games because I think there's some very interesting things going on in skirmish games. But yeah, go ahead and tell us tell us some of the stuff that you have done as well as stuff you're working on now.
All right. Well, I officially became a professional game designer, if you will, in 2017, and that I was working with a publisher to make something. Uh, Now, through a series of comedic errors that we don't need to entirely get into, my first actual publication came out in 2021. So it took a little longer than anticipated, but back in on April Fool's Day, April 1st, 2021, I released my first tabletop RPG called Freelancer Skies Over to Lindia. It's an industrial fantasy, think World War One, but with dragons and airships. Um, that one's had some pretty great success. For a first game, I'm very proud of how it's done. I actually just published a module for it just a few months ago now, called The Vanishing Airship, where you track down a missing airship and rescue the people and, well, everything else that was on it, that maybe some people care more about what was on it than the people. I have another a card game coming out next year called Long Live the King. It's tentatively scheduled for a quarter 1 release. Last I checked, I do need to call my publisher and make sure everything's still on track there. But Long Live the King is a game about making sure the king doesn't live very long.
That's
Um,
awesome.
you and the other players build a conspiracy of aristocrats, which are the different cards, and you murder each other and bribe other nobles to join your conspiracy and work your way up. But it's got a bluffing element. You can pretend you have a noble, you don't, to use their ability, and people call you out on it. It can be a problem. So that's what board games, tabletop games. I do have two other modules coming further future. Too early to give any kind of date on those.
Yeah.
Um,
And let's
Now
talk
for
about
skirmish
your.
game.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Oh,
want to. Let's just take a little bit because your tabletop roleplay game, first of all, is really cool. I don't get a chance to play roleplay games these days just because I have little time. I'm hoping in the future, but it reminds me of sort of like I think like Final Fantasy meets steampunk, right? Is that kind of it
um,
has it's like steampunk, but a little bit of a lighter filter. Yeah, maybe kind of go into that a little bit.
so it's actually what we call diesel punk. So it's a
Mm.
little bit technologically more advanced than steampunk. So you got people wearing flight goggles instead of the cogs and wheels and things like that.
Hmm.
But so yeah, it's let's see. So industrial fantasy, as I said, In it, you play as knights called freelancers, but instead of riding horses, you have your own airship or a biplane or something like
Mhm.
that. Um, and it's just, I'm struggling to exactly answer your question. But so there's some elements of Final Fantasy, but one of the big kind of deals I wanted in it is that you are mundane people in a magical world.
Hmm.
So the world is full of magic. There's dragons, there's horrible mutating monsters that if you're not careful, you can end up as one, which is obviously unideal. But what do you have? You have a trusty bolt action rifle and you have tactics. So even in a tabletop RPG, I couldn't help but put a little bit of miniature gaming in there.
Yeah.
Um, it actually has a large grid. Instead of each square for one model, a square is a 15 by 15 foot area. Um, and you actually have to tactically position yourself as a team to flank and take down your enemies, things like that. So couldn't help but inject a bit of tactics and skirmish in there. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I've gotten great feedback. I actually have gotten to talk to some people. It's amazing hearing people playing your game.
Yeah, that is
Um,
cool.
there's a group active on our Discord that has been playing every weekend since release.
Oh, that's
And it's
awesome.
just kind of amazing to see them sharing their stories. And like as a game designer, that's the dream right there is seeing people excited about, and you would not believe what happened when he threw that grenade. Why would he throw that grenade? We were all cursing him out for the rest of the night. Um, there's one particular story where someone threw a grenade into an ammo dump, and they all had to, in the middle of a stealth operation, I should point out.
What?
So they all had to flee rather quickly. And I just thought, yeah, that's tabletop role playing games right there.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I wanted to make sure that you got because I think that's I don't want to like your RPG world. One of the things that like we've talked a lot, Jacob, you're so creative. Like I'm not that person. You come up with these ideas like you mentioned headball and like I don't have that pure to like just come up with these ideas which are awesome. So anyway, just wanted to give an extra pitch to your RPG.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, continue on about your skirmish games. I
Oh yeah.
apologize.
So the one I've been working on the most recently is called Shattered Arcana, which I actually input into the One Box War Game Challenge. That was it's still ongoing. Actually, they just put up the sci-fi voting round this morning, the day we're recording this podcast. Um, that's been really fun. The challenge is to build an entire war game that uses only a single box. Um, I've gotten to see some very, very interesting things out there. One person even using something you can buy off Amazon for $8, these little plastic toy spaceships, and it's a asteroid racing league. Uh, there's just some really interesting stuff out there. So Shattered Arcana is the one I made. It is a dark fantasy where the gods are dying and they're crumbling to pieces. So as their bits of dead god fall from the heavens, you all fight over those to try to ascend to godhood yourself. It's the end of the world. The cycle's about to end. Who will the new gods be? That's the challenge of the game.
Yeah,
So that one's been a lot of fun.
it's good too. I play tested that game. Very enjoyable, very tight tactical skirmish game. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it uses tarot cards, which I know is not something you see super often. The tarot cards are not only how you determine your random chances, they also determine what actions you have available at any given time. And you even just use a card itself as the measuring tool of the game, which it's pretty great. You just have the one deck of cards, and that's everything you need to play. Um, well, and the miniatures, of course. Yeah, very happy with how that's gone. The voting round for fantasy did end. I did not advance, unfortunately. I was so close. I think I was seventh in the top five progressed. If I recall correctly, I was seventh or eighth. I don't remember off the top of my head. But I'm very happy with it, especially considering I made that game in less than a month. So very fun challenge. A lot of great games there. I highly recommend you check it out. Other than that, I'm also working on one called Deep Patrol, where I am in talks with a publisher. They are reviewing it, and that's a long process. So they'll get back to me at some point. But we just had we recently talked just last week, so progress is happening there. But Deep Patrol, you play as a team of dwarves going in to reclaim your ancestral hold for the most part. It's an asymmetrical game. One player is the Deep, and they are the horrible Dark Lord of Evil who controls all the goblins and orcs and any other monster that shows up. Whereas everyone else has a single dwarf hero and maybe a couple companions for them. We've playtested that one a bit locally, fair bit. More playtesting on that will happen soon, perhaps
Hmm.
even open playtesting. I'm not sure how far that'll go at this stage. Kind of depends on what the publisher wants. Other than that, I mean, I have a couple other projects that are early stages. We mentioned Headball before. Headball is actually in a playtestable state. I
Oh,
also have
that's
a
cool.
cyberpunk game that's in a playtestable state,
Yeah.
but they're kind of early days to talk too in depth about at this point.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Um, and it's interesting that we start getting onto to skirmish games because I feel I talked with miniature gaming montage last week about just skirmish games and just it feels like we're in a sort of just a renaissance of sort of skirmish games. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of different takes, a lot of great creativity. I have so many skirmish games I want to get into. It's just trying to find time to really get into them.
I
Um,
mean,
maybe so I wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit about skirmish games and about balance and how you feel. But real quick, is there any skirmish games out there right now that really just excite you?
ooh, um, yeah, actually, right here at my desk, I have Torch and Shield. That's one I'm really interested in. Um, it's kind of a dungeon crawler, very interesting game where your lights keep flickering out and you're trying to fight each other, but the environment might also get you. I also happen to have Gaslands sitting on my desk,
Hmm.
and a few Hot Wheels cars just down beside it. So looking forward to trying out Gaslands in the near future. Other than that, I am playing a fairly strong amount of Marvel Crisis Protocol. That one's kind
Yeah,
of got me
yeah.
hooked. I'm a huge Thor fan in Marvel Comics, so the fact that they let me be Thor with, all of the many of the characters I know and love in the squad, that's pretty cool. It also is just a great game. It really does the narrative on the tabletop well.
Yeah.
Um, Other than that, I have, thanks to the One Box War Game Challenge, I have about 2 dozen kind of indie games I have set up that I'm going through and trying to. I play tested a couple just on my kitchen table, but definitely, definitely ones I want to try out there.
Hmm. Okay, very cool. And yeah, Gaslands has been a game that it's always been on my radar. The only reason I haven't played it is because it's just trying to find that time. And I think that's
Yep.
the interesting thing about the skirmish game, especially games in general, but especially skirmish games where it's just, there are so many great ones, you can only do so much.
Oh yeah.
Um, so I love talking with you, Jake, because you are a game designer, and I always find that not only are you creative from just a story perspective, but you've got a real good head for the game as far as like this is your wheelhouse. What you do every day about talking about you're talking about a lot right now, playtesting and what it actually takes to create a game and the amount of playtesting that all goes into it, and to sort of create this magical formula that's fun, right? Making a game fun.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
one
important.
and one sort of we hear it a lot right now is balance in games. So I'd love to sort of hear how do you view, especially skirmish games. Let's be a little. So how do you view game balance as a skirmish game, right? Do you think, first of all, do you think that game balance in a skirmish game is important? Is it achievable? How do you sort of fall on that scale? We get a lot of opinions from, I always feel, players about, they think this game is this or this or this. But as a
Mhm.
person who designs games and playtests games, where does balance fall on that scale of, I guess, making a game, a skirmish game, successful, as in quotes?
Ooh, balance. Balance is definitely a very tricky topic. Imagine you're balancing a pile of rocks on top of itself. There's some people who can do these amazing, tall, perfectly balanced stacks. When I try, it topples pretty quick. Um, but it's kind of like that. It's difficult to get things balanced precisely, but the big issue too is when people talk about balance, I feel like there's multiple things they're actually talking about. Uh, so I know we've discussed this before in private and in other places, but I feel like there's three types of balance. There's internal balance, there's external balance, and then there's perceived balance. Um, but yeah, I mean, you look at any gaming community, any game that has enough to have a community, you will find someone upset about balance. Go on Facebook, go to a Discord server, someone will probably be arguing about this is not balanced, this is too strong, this is too weak. Um, Followed right by someone probably jumping up and going, no, it's perfect. You don't know what you're talking about. But there's a reason we all get worked up about it. We all get passionate about it. It's important. If a game is unbalanced, it tends to be a bad thing. Now there are exceptions. Blood Bowl is horribly imbalanced, but that's okay because you know that's what you're getting in Blood Bowl. If you choose to play as halflings, you shouldn't be surprised when half your halflings are meat paste by the end of the game. I mean, that's halflings. That's Blood Bowl. But that is kind of an intentional unbalancing, which that's a whole other can of worms. So let's just kind of get into what the types of balance are. So internal, external, these are the types that people are most familiar with. Um, Internal is you look within a certain faction or class or build or what have you and ask, is it balanced? So let's say I'm playing Marvel Crisis Protocol because that's on my mind. Threat values are how you determine the cost of a character. Let's say there's two characters that cost 5 threat. I'm just gonna, I mean, whichever two you want.
Yeah.
Are they more or less balanced? Are they both worth bringing 5 threat? Now,
Hmm.
where it gets tricky is the answer might be, well, yes, in certain scenarios for this character, and yes, in other scenarios for the other. And that's okay as long as they're providing a similar value.
Hmm.
Also, if you have a character that costs 2 threat versus a character that costs 4 threat, the character that costs 4 threat should probably be better than the character that costs two. So this is kind of internal balance. External balance is more in games that have factions, where does my faction compare to other factions? So this is one that I think just about anyone who's ever played Warhammer or Warhammer 40K will immediately recognize, um, because there's someone on a forum right now telling you that Tau is underpowered and needs to be improved, or
Yeah.
that Tau is overpowered and needs to be nerfed.
Hmm.
Um, so that's external balance. If one faction is stronger than the others or weaker than the others, that should be adjusted. Um, Ideally, these things are worked out before the game is ever released, but practically, especially when you're doing a very large game with a lot of different factions, a lot of different kind of interplay there, balance is extremely hard to do until you get a lot of data.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, so those are kind of the
Two.
two kind of that game designers can really work on upfront, external and internal balance. Now, the last one is the trickiest. It's perceived balance. How does it feel? Um, Tabletop RPGs have a great example. let's say you have a 50-50 chance of success on a roll every time. When game designers for RPGs were kind of looking into it, they saw that when people had a 50-50 chance to succeed, they all felt like they were failing most of the time.
That's right. Yeah.
And it wasn't until you got to about a 70-30 chance of success or failure that people felt like, oh, yeah, this seems like I'm succeeding and failing at an equal rate, which is crazy. You're definitely succeeding more at 70%, but that's not how it feels.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because
Um,
you don't remember, and I think this goes back to like psychology even, that we
mhm.
don't remember like our failures are oftentimes a much bigger impact. In psychology, they even call it something like loss aversion, right? We're
Yes.
much we're much greater impacted by our losses than our wins. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think a big part of it too is perceived balance also plays into, let's say you failed at something. Do you feel like you had a chance at success?
Hmm.
So actually on it was Glenn Ford, I believe, who said this. They were talking about the old railroad tycoon game. Glenn Ford, by the way, is another game designer. Great, great guy. Um, Railroad Tycoon, when they were first making it, they just had floods happen that would just destroy your tracks. And people didn't find that satisfying at all, which seems surprising because people liked disasters in SimCity.
Hmm.
But then they made it so floods would destroy some things. So, like, let's say you had bridges. Well, if you built a cheap bridge out of wood, the flood's going to destroy it. If you built the really expensive bridge out of steel, now the bridge makes it. So, if you build a bunch of wood bridges, and a flood comes and wipes a bunch of them out, that still feels fair to you
Yeah.
because it's not this surprise you couldn't have done anything about. And that, I think, is where a lot of perceived balance comes in. Do you feel like you could have done something and you didn't, or maybe you didn't bring the right tools for the job? Um, that's where a lot of that comes into as well.
Yeah, and I think it's something that I've been always thinking about as far as a person who is a player. So I'm not a game designer, but what I feel I am is I'm a player who especially on my channel more and more has gotten into arbitrating what is what is good and what is bad. And people listen on my channel and take me as well, some people take me as authority. Some people think I'm an idiot, one of the many. I think though what you said is something very fascinating about perceived balance, and that is control. I think to me personally, what I value very highly in a war game is I think we've talked previously about what's called we've mentioned tactical depth, that
Mhm.
your decisions matter. And if it's the scenario or if it's your army, puts you in a situation where there is no decision in what you need to do, right? You must move this model here or you lose the game. It's sort of that is where I sort of dislike some aspect of a game where there is no choice, where it's
Mhm.
basically like in an RPG you're railroaded, where the scenario or the army says, you're basically there is no choice. You must do this, every turn. And I think that is probably, do you feel that's sort of tying into perceived balance about how there is a certain like decision making or do some people, maybe I'm too wrong though, am I projecting off what many players who may just want to have their choices made for them, and then it's a little more beer and pretzel. Like, am I sort of maybe I shouldn't generalize? What do you kind of think about that, Jacob?
That's a tough one because
Yeah.
generally balance is like a balance issue happens when you don't have a choice to counter something. Like you can't do it. You
Hmm.
can't choose what you want to. Whereas something where it's like there's only one correct choice, I feel like that's a separate issue.
Hmm.
Where it's still an issue because now the game is almost like a solved game, like a tic-tac-toe, you know.
Hmm.
There's only so many places you can put your little X or your little O to determine if it is a win or a draw. And like we've solved it. We know exactly where you need to put your X at the start and where you need to go next based on what O does. to see if it's going to be a win for you or a cat game. It's totally solved. If a skirmish game gets there, that is a really unsatisfying moment because, I mean, one of the joys of skirmish games is the fact that you have really almost an infinite amount of options in the three-dimensional space you have in front of you. I mean, if you have a unit that can move 6 inches in any direction, suddenly the possible places you could put it are truly astronomical.
Hmm.
But, obviously, part of being once you get at all familiar with the game, you're really going to look at them and be like, okay, there's three things I can do
Hmm.
that are not just mind-numbingly stupid, or just utterly inferior. But when there's only one option, that's really unsatisfying because one of the promises of miniature gaming in general is the fact that you have that freedom, the fact that your choices matter. And if your choices don't matter, I don't think that's the balance issue as much as that's just I mean, that's a core design flaw,
Hmm.
um, in my
Okay.
opinion.
Okay. That's interesting too. So when you look at so for one, from what I've heard of you, you have mentioned that it seems like you feel that game balance is important, to an extent, right there,
Mhm.
like I think even within, like you mentioned, Blood Bowl, there are a lot of teams which are a little more on the balanced side. I know that game has gone through years of not only community balancing, but when they got back into it as well. It sounds though that balance is important on some level, right? That
Mhm.
people, um, achievable. So you feel it is achievable. What you're saying, it's very difficult because you need a lot of data.
I would say perfect balance is utterly unattainable.
Hmm.
Um, you can never have something perfectly balanced. I mean, people often bring up chess as kind of a joke about, oh, there's a perfectly balanced game. Everyone has the same pieces. Except it's not perfectly balanced
That's
because
right.
there's a huge advantage to whoever goes first.
Hmm.
So, is perfect balance achievable? I don't think so. Um, is very good balance achievable? Is satisfying levels of balance achievable? I certainly think so.
Hmm.
There are many games I've played that I've felt like had a satisfying balance. Now, within those games, there have been a few pieces not so much. Like, I do enjoy the balance overall of Marvel Crisis Protocol, but I do look at a model like She-Hulk and wonder what's happening there.
Hmm.
She needs a bit of a boost. I do look at my lovely Thor, hero of Midgard, and think, is he maybe a bit much?
Yeah, I see.
If you're listening, AMG, never, never tune him down. I love Thor. Thank you.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And well, you're actually hitting on something because I want to talk about skirmish games specifically. There
Hmm.
is, because you have much fewer models, there is a much more closer desire to actually get, what's the word, to develop a relationship almost with your models. Blood Bowl, Mordenheim, Necromunda. We name these characters. We invest something, and when they die, I've lost Blood Bowl, Mordheim, Necromunda, and it hurts. This was a person who had named, even though you never spoke it out to your opponent, in your
Right.
mind, you had literally created a character, and I love that about skirmish games. So
Oh,
is
yeah.
that also how you have this partiality to Thor, and you're just like, don't tune him down because, there's something personal there. Um, which, so it feels like it just adds another problem to the mix, right?
Well, I am mostly kidding. If they tune him down, I'm going to run him no matter what, because,
Yeah,
like I
yeah.
said, I'm a huge Thor fanboy. But you are correct. When names get attached to characters, people definitely get, especially just the more character you have in any model, there's a lot of passion that gets in that. And I mean, when you talk about miniature gaming, especially, it's not just that, I'm fielding this knight and I named him, that matters. It's I'm fielding this knight that I built, that I
Yep.
might have kit bashed or converted, that I painted. Theoretically, don't look at my armies too closely. There's a lot of gray plastic still. Um, but you've taken the time to not just select the model you wanted, but then go through that whole process. It's an investment. Every model is a bit of an investment. So that is definitely something that I would say impacts things like perceived balance, how satisfying a game is. It's why when, you back in Warhammer 7th edition, my wife, who's a gamer as well, she played High Elves, she put her dragon down, and the Empire player across the table fires three cannonballs right into the dragon's face and kills it
Yep.
immediately.
Yep.
And that felt horrible for because, I mean, she spent more time than usual on this amazing dragon model, and then it doesn't get to do anything. So that's another issue in itself.
Yeah, and it's on my
Yeah.
mind because I'm getting into Trench Crusade and I'm
Oh, yeah.
building my warband and I'm literally already creating in my mind little stories of who my warband is going to be, and I know that every time they die or something, it's gonna hurt me, but that's also part of it, and it's really a fascinating thing
Oh, yeah.
that is it's very, like I said, it's really interesting that it's like, you're a Moorheim player, so you know that experience about it. um well, really cool, really cool. So Jacob, I would love to keep you on forever and love to talk about things. Want to kind of close out here as well. So any last thoughts, and we'll have you on a future, but is there any last thoughts about sort of game balance or that you sort of wanted to mention? um
Hmm. You know, just the big thing is it's really tricky.
mhm,
But the first thing you should probably identify is what type of balance you're trying to work on,
mhm.
what type of balance you have an issue with. Because if you just start trying to make changes and you don't really understand what an issue is, then you're not really going to have good changes. So it's hard. It's just very, very hard.
How do you collect data? Because I know you've mentioned data. So
Oh,
obviously you have games that have been so there's clearly your games have been fun enough and like not only published, people play them. So how do you have a process about quote balancing a game? How do you gotta do that?
oh. Um, yes. Um, I could probably do a whole other podcast with you just on that process.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the general idea is if something feels too weak, I double its power. Something feels too strong, I have its power.
Oh wow.
And then try to find the middle point between those two. That's a very vague general thing I do. Um, which, someone always gets that play test where they have the double powered gun or whatever. And they're like, this thing's amazing. And then inevitably it's not quite that in the final version. But that's kind of a general thing. The big thing, though, is if you're trying to design a game yourself, playtest as often as possible. Even if you don't have an opponent, sit down and playtest both sides at the kitchen table. As long as your game doesn't require a lot of bluffing, that's pretty easy to do. Um, Other than that, yeah, playtest as often as you can, as early as you can. I mean, I've playtested games before I've had all the rules figured out. Um, so I
Yeah.
playtested a game. I did a little short playtest, just a couple rounds of my Cyberpunk game I started working on. I'm like, this guy has an evasion of three. What does evasion do? I'll try a few things out, see what I like. And eventually I'm like, I think this is how I want evasion to work. Okay, that's the system. That's what evasion 3 means. Should probably only be evasion 2. Um, so it's really just play it. And then after you've play tested it a bit, get other people to play test it without you controlling anything.
Yeah.
Ideally, without you I mean, with just handing them a rule book would be the dream, but that's not really feasible in a lot of situations.
Okay.
Um, but see how people do with your game without your guidance, without you automatically smoothing things out can be a really good thing as well.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you've pointed that out actually, that there is no head figuring out. It's got to be played. And I think that's something that I've taken away from talking with you here is that you have to play test.
Yeah.
You can't head hammer it. It's got to be play tested. It's got to be put on the table and sort of seen. So I really like that. Well, Jacob, love to keep you on. I'd like to ask this question. So, Jacob, what is your dream wargaming experience? What would you, if we had all the time and money in the world, what would you love to just do as far as a dream in wargaming?
Oh man. Well, I think I have weirdly two dream wargame experiences. One as a player, one as a designer. Um, as a player, I think my dream would just be to right now find the time to paint my miniatures. I have a toddler that requires a lot of time. My table, my painting station is pretty much just taken over for a while. So the gray plastic legions continue to march on. Um, so that's my current dream is just being able to actually paint my dudes.
Hmm.
Um, but as a designer, I think one of my dreams would just be to walk into a store I've never been in and find someone playing my game. Like that would
Yeah,
be in my mind
that's
the
cool.
most exciting thing that could happen. One of my co-designers on the, or he's a developer on my RPG, has actually had that happen. I have not, so
Mm.
a little frustrated that he got to see it and I didn't. But
Oh, cool,
yeah,
cool.
um, those I say would be my dreams. I know those probably aren't exactly what you were thinking, but
No, no,
that's it.
that's a great thing. Well, cool. So, you've already mentioned your RPG, and we'll post all your links in the description. But just for those who just want to hear, tell us where they can find your RPG, and where, yeah, anything what they should be on the lookout for.
Yes, so it's called Freelancers Skies Over Talendia. You can find it at safehavengames.com. There's a hyphen between Safe Haven and Games.
Hmm.
Um, if you just search Freelancer Skies Over Talini on Google, you'll find it as well. Uh, the big rulebook is available, as is the new module, and pretty soon some STLs for those of you with 3D printers of
Oh, that's awesome.
the many horrible monsters and noble creatures you might encounter, as well as some of the player characters. There's also freelancerrpg.com is a uh, older link that shows you some of those STLs and gives you kind of a primer on the world. So please check it out and hope you enjoy.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for your time.
Thank you too, Dan.
All right, bye.
Bye.
I'll just edit this out. All right.